Alrighty, so I'm David Barboza. I'm the Director of Policy and Research for Abundant Housing LA. And happy to be speaking with you this afternoon about the bills that we're supporting. Jaime actually reminded me that I goofed a little bit and I was supposed to focus just on the top 10, but I actually included info about all 18 that we've supported so far. So I'll try not to dwell too long on some of the other ones. But, thinking about how we advocate for change on the housing front in Sacramento really starts with our policy agenda and the themes there. So the themes are legalizing more homes, making homes easier to build, funding affordable housing, and strengthening renters' rights, all on a foundation of promoting racial justice and equity. So here, just a quick overview of the legislative process. Sacramento operates on a 2-year cycle, and we're in the second year of that cycle. So it starts, the current year, started in January when the legislature reconvened and started proposing new bills. And then, the bills have to go through policy committees. So, for example, in the Assembly, we have housing and community development, local government. In the Senate, there's a housing committee and a governance and finance committee that most of our bills have to go through. And then if the bills are tagged as having a fiscal impact, they'll go to an appropriations committee. And so we actually just had a deadline for bills to get out of appropriations and onto the floor. And so the floor, meaning like the whole House will vote on the bills. So there's a deadline for bills that originated in one House to clear that House coming up at the end of this week. And then when bills clear their original House, they do the same thing in the other House and go through the policy committees, the fiscal committee. And then if there are amendments in the second House, there has to be a conference committee to reconcile the different versions of the bill so that each House can vote on the same thing. And then they have until the end of August bills have until the end of August to clear the legislature and get to the governor. And the governor has a month to decide what he's going to do, if he's going to sign or veto the bills. And then new laws will take effect typically on January 1st. So the first theme in our agenda is legalizing more homes. So here we've got AB 2011 by Assemblymember Wicks, the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee. So this would legalize housing in commercial zones, and it would do so subject to some requirements around labor standards and affordability. So for example, there's a requirement to pay prevailing wages on projects that use this bill, and there's a skilled and trained workforce requirement. So the political dynamics here are really interesting because organized labor is actually divided on this bill. So you have the state building trades, which are a very powerful lobby in Sacramento, in opposition, but then other factions of labor like the carpenters, SEIU in favor due to the benefits of this bill for solving the housing crisis. So we had some really good news on this bill yesterday. It cleared the Assembly, so now it's on to Senate policy committees. And so just to talk a little bit more about what this bill would do, not only would it legalize housing in commercial zones, but it would do so subject to a ministerial review process, which is planning speak for you have to review the project based on objective standards, and it's not subject to environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act. So ministerial is like the opposite of discretionary, where you apply subjective standards, which are often based on aesthetics or people's concerns about the project's impact on the community through a board or committee process to build. So ministerial is good for getting housing built quickly and affordably. So the next bill, Senate Bill 6, is very similar. The SB 6 actually originated last year, and it purported to do basically the same thing, legalize housing in commercial zones. But it had less of a detailed treatment about these labor issues that have stymied so many housing bills in the past. So this bill is essentially stalled out, cleared the Senate in Assembly policy committees, but it really looks like AB 2011 is the successor to SB 6. And AB 2011 really has the momentum behind it right now. Wanted to highlight SB 897 by Senator Wachowski, who's been, really a champion of accessory dwelling unit legislation that makes it easier to build these backyard homes or ADUs. So a couple of the good things about this bill are that it would make it so that you could build a 2-story ADU more easily. Currently, local governments have some discretion to cap the height of ADUs at 16 feet, which is essentially, not quite enough for 2 stories. So this would give people more flexibility, like if they wanted to build an ADU on top of their garage or something like that. And it has interesting multifamily ADU provisions. So existing law lets you propose the conversion of non-habitable spaces and multifamily structures to ADUs, like 1 ADU per 4 units. What this would do is reduce parking requirements when you do that and let you propose it initially instead of having to have an existing building and convert it. So you could propose the ADUs with an apartment building or a townhouse complex instead of having to wait until it's already built and do a second step. Okay, so next theme is making homes easier to build. So here we're super excited about AB 2097 by Assemblymember Friedman. This is a parking reform bill that would make it so that local governments couldn't apply minimum parking requirements within a half mile of a major transit stop. Major transit stop means like a passenger rail station or the intersection of 2 bus lines with frequent service. And so importantly, this would apply both to residential and commercial projects, which some competing bills do not do. And so, it's important. So that's important kind of like to build support for the bill, because some of the people who might appreciate this are businesses who, like when a business wants to go into a particular shopping center and change the use, sometimes they can't because, they're getting hit with a higher parking requirement. And of course, this has major benefits for housing affordability, to be able to, kind of right size the amount of parking according to what people actually need instead of some arbitrary government mandate. Here the politics are really interesting. This is a successor to a bill, AB 1401 from last year that didn't make it. AB 1401 actually got all the way through the Assembly, got through Senate policy committees, and got to the Senate Appropriations Committee, where it was held up and it wasn't allowed to advance to the floor. So this is where kind of like understanding the process is important. Sometimes these bills get tagged as having a fiscal impact, even though the fiscal impact of this bill is obviously pretty minimal in terms of like how it impacts the state's finances. We're developing a strategy to try to work with, especially focus on that Senate Appropriations Committee, and make sure that we can build the support in all those members' districts to push this bill through. And then, another thing here is the dynamic of organized labor. So we did get some opposition from the state trades on this. So we're trying to work through that. But it seems like, a lot of their fire is actually concentrated on AB 2011. So we're hoping maybe that lets 2097 move through more easily. So the next one is one to highlight is AB 1910 by Christina Garcia. This is a grant program that would incentivize the conversion of public golf courses to housing and public open space. So, unfortunately, this one did not clear the Assembly Appropriations Committee by the deadline. But you wanted to highlight it just as an interesting idea. This one got a lot of active opposition from people who like to golf, which apparently can be activated as a very strong lobby when they feel like their interests are threatened. So, but the bill, it wouldn't have required anybody to do anything. It just would have provided funding to study how a public golf course might be converted to housing and open space. AB 989 is next. So this would create an administrative process. And so basically what's going on here is like, if you're proposing housing and it gets denied, and you want to allege that there's been a violation of the AHLA or Housing Accountability Act, this bill would create an administrative process so that you could kind of essentially like go to arbitration instead of having to go to court, which could help things out. So this is, it got all the way through the Assembly, all the way to the Senate floor, and then it was ordered to an inactive file last year. So we haven't seen a lot of movement on this one this year. The next up is AB 682 by Assemblymember Bloom. So this is a density bonus for co-housing buildings. So really interesting, like, you know, if anybody's ever lived in certain college dorms, I spent a couple of years living in a situation like that, where it's like you kind of have a unit and then some of the facilities like kitchens or bathrooms are like in common and shared with other units. So that's one potential option to build housing more affordably. You know, it shouldn't be the only option, but it's one possible option. So this would essentially like grant a density bonus. So like existing state law and density bonuses kind of says, like, if you're including affordable units in your project, then you get to build at a higher density, get relief from a certain number of zoning standards, and get more flexible parking requirements. So this is kind of expanding that concept to co-housing. All right, and then next up is SB 886 by Senator Wiener. So this is a really exciting bill to allow public universities to build housing for students, faculty, and staff without having to go through environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act. So that would allow them to, you know, build this housing more quickly and affordably, which we think is great. The bill takes a nuanced approach to environmental issues. So, for example, like it wouldn't allow you to use that exemption on certain environmentally sensitive lands, like a high fire hazard severity zone or like a floodplain. And, you know, we are watching amendments to this bill. You know, it is being amended to require projects to kind of do more to address the greenhouse gas emissions. Although, you know, we do feel like these kinds of projects tend to be inherently better for the environment because you're building housing near a university so students don't have to commute. I mean, it kind of inherently reduces the need to drive and things of that nature. So a little bit concerned about the amendments, but it's still a good bill. All right, and then moving on to SCA or Senate Constitutional Amendment 2. So this would repeal Article 34 of the California Constitution. Article 34 is a part of our Constitution that came in 1950 in a really problematic way. But what it does is it requires a public vote for what it terms low rent housing projects that are essentially assisted by public funds. So what happened was the campaign for this was carried out in an explicitly racist manner, where they were appealing to people's fears around racial integration in 1950. And also kind of, there was a lot of rhetoric also in the vein of like anti-communism. This was right around the time that the US was getting into the Korean War and, you know, right at the heart of the Cold War. So, and to give an example of how this affects a place like LA, you know, LA had to do an election basically to say, like, you can build a certain number of these housing units in each council district. And now what's happening is we're hitting the cap in some of the council districts. And so the LA Housing Department has written to the city council to request a new election to like increase these authorizations to build these types of affordable housing. But, you know, we think it would be much better if all those resources and all that energy could be directed to actually building affordable housing instead of having to constantly ask voters if it's a good idea to build affordable housing. So what happens is if this passes, it goes to the state's voters for approval. And one of the big issues here is making sure that there's you know, adequate kind of muscle behind the campaign to educate the state's voters on why Article 34 is so problematic. Okay, so moving on to SB 1369. So this is a really interesting bill that would facilitate adaptive reuse projects. That's when you have a building and you're converting it from one use to another, in this case to residential. So there's that term ministerial again. Okay, so it would require ministerial approval, meaning, only objective standards and no CEQA. Another good thing that this bill would do is it would cap the amount of parking. Like, it would basically say, like, the amount of parking that's on the site now is the amount of parking. You can't require more than that when the use changes. So this was, the city of LA is known for having done something like this in the late 90s, which really helped to facilitate the revival of downtown LA. Because, like, under old codes, you would have had to, you'd have all these historic buildings that were built with like no parking. And then under the old codes, you would have had to like knock down the building next door to build a parking garage in order to occupy the first building, which made absolutely no sense. It was terrible for historic preservation in the environment. And so what this was attempting to do is kind of apply that concept statewide. But unfortunately, it missed a policy committee deadline recently. Okay, so moving on to the next theme, funding affordable housing. So SB 679 is a bill that we're very involved with. This would create the Los Angeles County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, or La Casa. So this bill originated last year. It's cleared the Senate and been re-referred to the Assembly HCD Committee, Housing and Community Development. Sorry, I have to watch my acronyms. But yeah, so, we're involved with the Our Future LA Coalition to push this bill. We meet with them weekly to talk about legislative strategy. Right now, the group's assessment is that the critical thing is kind of letting Speaker Rendon know that this is important to folks, and particularly to local governments in LA County. So he has a district in Southeast LA County. If anybody lives there, it'd be great to reach out to him because he's your assembly member. And we also work on policy issues around the bill. Like there's still negotiations happening around the exact composition of the governing board and the extent to which these projects should be exempt from CEQA. But, and I should say what the bill would do. So it would actually, this would be like a public authority that would have a governing board that's composed of like LA City, LA County, and like different local cities, basically. And it would be able to put affordable housing funding measures on the ballot. So it'd make it easier to qualify those measures for the ballot. And it would also provide technical assistance in the realm of affordable housing and tenant protections to local governments who are interested in doing more in those areas. Because you got to remember, we've got 89 local government jurisdictions in the county, and there are some like the city of LA, county of LA, that have a lot of experience with this stuff. And many others that really don't. And so like the technical assistance piece is important. And then next up, we've got Assembly Constitutional Amendment 14 by Assemblymember Wicks, which would dedicate at least 5% of the state's general fund for affordable housing. So this one, similarly is a constitutional amendment. So it would have to, if it passes through the legislature, it has to go to the voters. So we're keeping an eye on that one. All right, so moving on to renters' rights and tenant protections. So AB 2050 by Assemblymember Lee, really interesting bill that would limit Ellis Act evictions. The Ellis Act is a state law that lets you as a landlord go out of the rental housing business. So one of the ways that we see this happen sometimes is like a landlord will say, oh, I don't want to be a landlord anymore. I want to convert this apartment building to condos, which, it can have, and that can lead to tenants being evicted. So what this bill would do is say, if you're invoking the Ellis Act, you have to have owned the property for at least 5 years prior. And you can't, like, if you've invoked the Ellis Act within the last 10 years, can't invoke it again until that 10-year period has elapsed, even if it was for another property, right? So, this is an important measure to provide some stability to tenants. It doesn't completely stop those processes from happening, but it just kind of makes it harder to use the Ellis Act if you're like just a flipper or a speculator. All right, so AB 2383. So this would regulate how a landlord can inquire about criminal history information when somebody is applying for rental housing. So we know that, there's a lot of academic research out there, great scholarship like from Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, regarding like the disproportionate impact that incarceration has on people of color. And not because of different rates of criminality, but because of like the way that our laws are enforced in an inequitable manner. So what this does is says, if you're taking applications for rental housing, the first round of review basically has to be based on objective criteria. So it's like you're looking at people's ability to pay the rent, basically. And then, if after that, you can inquire about criminal history information, but applicants would have some rights there. So it's like if you're thinking of denying them on that basis, they would have the right to kind of present evidence of rehabilitation or point out any inaccuracies that you might have had in your info, right? So we think that this is an important policy to, help population of people that's oftentimes overlooked but has severe housing challenges. You can't really reintegrate into society or live your life if you can't get housing, right? Okay, and then AB 889, this is another, this would require disclosure of who the owners of an LLC are if that entity owns rental housing. So the idea here is to be able to have some accountability for folks and make sure that properties are being properly maintained, and you can actually kind of know who's ultimately responsible for a property. All right, and then a few more here, just on the theme of promoting racial justice and equity. So Senate Constitutional Amendment 9. So this would create a right to housing, which is a really interesting concept that we've decided to support. It's the language here, it's brief, but it's kind of like in the style of other declarations of fundamental rights that are found in the California and federal constitutions. And it kind of says like the state and local governments have a joint responsibility to ensure that the right to housing is respected, consistent with available resources, and expeditiously. Right, so this would create, opportunities for people to go to court if a local government, is really acting egregiously with regard to housing. And, admittedly, there's some space here where the courts would have to interpret what the right means, but we think it's an important framework for moving forward. AB 1685, so parking citation forgiveness program for people experiencing homelessness. So what happens a lot of the time is people experiencing homelessness may have to resort to sheltering in vehicles because that's better than living on the street, but it's still a form of homelessness. And oftentimes local governments will get complaints from, housed neighbors about these folks, and then use their authority over parking regulations to kind of make it hard for unhoused folks to be in a particular area. And then tickets can pile up. And of course, if you're in those circumstances, paying these tickets is not really feasible. And it's also just kind of a financial barrier to getting back on your feet in general. So we don't think there's really a constructive purpose to that. So this allows for folks to apply for relief from those kinds of citations that are really intended to harass in this context. And then AB 1778 is another interesting one. So this would restrict state spending on freeways in areas with high pollution and poverty. This is on the assembly floor. So, the idea here, it's with freeways, what's the connection to housing? Well, when you expand a freeway, you demolish housing, right? And there's also evidence that, these kinds of projects, like the negative environmental impacts, the negative impacts in terms of home demolitions, disproportionately affect people of color. There's been a lot of great reporting and local organizing around this recently. And so, yeah, we think that the state, should not be contributing to that. And we should be making, transportation investments that are aligned with our climate goals and that are respectful of the need to not just prevent housing from being demolished, but to support the denser housing that's more affordable and all of that good stuff. Okay. All right, so just a little bit about how we advocate. So we'll stake out bills and write a position letter and then submit them to the state's position letter portal so that the legislative committees can see them before they make a decision. We communicate with the public through our action alerts, our organizing in local chapters, by writing blog posts and op-eds. We'll call into committee hearings, meet with legislators and work in coalitions. So I already kind of mentioned some of the work we've been doing with the Our Future LA Coalition on SB 679. But we're also in a coalition pushing AB 2097, the parking reform bill regarding no parking requirements near major transit stops. So we're working with groups like California YIMBY, SPUR, Council of Infill Builders, on kind of coordinating our strategy and supporting 2097. And then we also host briefings in Sacramento for legislators and their staffs. So we did one recently on parking policy. There's another one coming up on housing element enforcement. And so just to highlight, things that you can do. So we have our action alerts, people on this call are probably already signed up to our email list, but if not, definitely sign up. You'll get a link that you can click on that takes you to a form that's super easy, and you can just send off a letter to your legislator like that. You can also, if you miss any of that stuff, you can also find them on our website. Go back. And then, if you're kind of lobbying your legislator on your own, I just wanted to take a minute, if I could, to kind of show you the state legislative information website. So I'm going to jump off here to this link. This is a really useful website, and so it's this is the home page. You just go down here, you can search for a bill, let's search for AB 2097. So this is showing you it always starts off with the Legislative Council's digest. So if the bill's super long and maybe you don't have time to read the whole thing, you can just read the summary and get a sense of what it is. And then if you go over here, to votes, you can see all of the votes that have happened on the bill. You can see how your representatives are voting on it, and kind of that helps you to hold them accountable. And the history tab also just kind of gives you a sense of where the bill is. So for example, this bill says, okay, it was referred to the Appropriations Committee, it passed out of that committee, which means it's going to the Assembly floor. The third reading means it's going to get voted on the Assembly floor, right? So you kind of know where the bill is. And then if you really want to get into it, you can go to My Subscriptions. These are actually my subscriptions. So I'm logged in. You just create a free account here. You can track any bill you want and get email alerts on it. So if you have one or two that you're really interested in, you can get an email every time the status changes on the bill. So that can be pretty neat. All right, so let me see, go back here. Oops. So, and then, just more advice is think about the way that you want to communicate. So there are pros and cons to email, phone, or in person. If you have time, in person can be great. It kind of sends the message you can visit your legislator's district office and they'll think wow, you took the time to come in, you must really care about this, right? And also, we always recommend mentioning that you're a constituent, that you live in the district, because, legislators, that's the political bottom line, right? Can you vote me out of office or not? So, you can be polite about it, but just say, yeah, I'm in your district, I care about this stuff. And, if you're talking, how many other people are just staying silent, and you're kind of representing so many other people in the community that just don't have time or haven't thought to raise an issue. Just always be polite. You always want to maintain the relationship with legislators, and be concise. They're busy, their staffs are busy, but be clear about what you want. Just make the ask. And then we have all of our position letters of state bills are on our website. So if there's one that's not specifically an action alert, you can still look at the letter and get the language if you're having writer's block about what to say. And then just, go for it. You may or may not have a lot of experience doing this kind of advocacy or lobbying, but once you do, it really becomes a habit, and you can definitely do it. Also, just wanted to mention, we have a policy committee. We meet quarterly and kind of talk through some of the trickier policy issues that we're thinking about. So, folks can get involved with that. Just let us know if you're interested. And then, consider donating to support our work. And then be happy to take any questions or hear any feedback that you have.
So we do have a few questions here. I'll start with reading them to you, David, and you can just answer them. So the first one is I had high hopes for SB9 unleashing a lot of new housing in desirable areas, but my sense is there has not been much activity. To be quantified, I was hoping for a 5% year increase in housing units in the key Bay Area cities, but it looks like the number may be less than 0.1%. Is this true? If so, do we know why? I feel like we should be clear on what the actual bottleneck is so we can widen the properly.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So unfortunately, I don't think I'm prepared right now to say exactly, like in a quantified way, what impact that SB9 has had on housing production so far. But I will say that HCD put out a memo recently, which I think is important for folks to be aware of, because it talks about the intersection of SB9 and ADU law. So one of the cool things is that so what SB9 does, just a quick recap, is it's a lot split and duplex bill. So you can split a lot and do 2 units on each lot, or do a second unit on a primary lot. But if you combine the allowances of SB9 and ADU law, you can actually do 4 units on 1 lot without having to split the lot. So that can be a pretty powerful way of going about it. Because I know, my past job working as a planner for a city, I know how difficult it can be to go through a subdivision process. That's a lot of work to go through, especially for a small number of units. So I think folks should definitely take advantage of that. Think about the intersection of those 2 laws.
Leonard, I saw you had your hand raised. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna put it in the chat, which is that I think it's too early for data on SB9's impact, but what I've heard is that there's preliminary information coming out from the Department of City Planning that SB9 is actually having a surprisingly big impact, especially on, it sounds like, lot splits. But again, that's anecdotal preliminary information.
All right, let's go to the next question. Will you be able to addressing AB 2713 to prevent homelessness? It will help prevent it by restricting eviction by new buyers using ELS Act for remodel, etc.
So, so if I understood correctly, you're talking about AB 2713. That bill I have not reviewed, although it does sound very similar to AB 2050. Which is Assemblymember Lee's ELS Act reform bill. So we're definitely in support of 2050. And if folks feel like the other bill is worth a look too, we can take a look at it. But
it looks like we have one in regards to same bill with comparison to AB 2050. How does AB 2050 compare to AB 2713? Differentiate also, which has better chance of passing?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I haven't reviewed 2713, so I'm not prepared to answer that question. But I will make a note to take a look at that. It sounds like something that we should be have on our radar. So.
All right, so we have another question here in the chat. On AB 2050, Ellis Act eviction are often a necessary step to add much needed housing density to underutilized infill properties. Our SO rules already prevent remodel for affordable units by requiring replacement units. An example will be a development buying an existing 2-unit property to add 20 new units in place. This will prevent this common type of development that adds more needed housing. Why support a bill that prevents new housing development?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think that, our answer to that would be like, going back to the themes in our policy agenda, we recognize that there's a need to produce more housing at all income levels. And we also recognize that, like, it's possible sometimes projects that do that end up having negative consequences for specific tenants. And like, it's also important to protect tenants, both like morally, but also like politically, right? Like if we're gonna build a coalition that's strong enough to really address these issues in a fundamental way, like we have to be able to talk to tenants and be able to like fight to protect tenant rights as well. So I think like, AB 2050 does not prevent all Ellis Act evictions. Like it's still possible under that bill for those evictions to occur, but it does restrict them so that they can't occur serially. And so we think that that's an appropriate balance to strike. And that we should look for sites. This is like another reason why it's so important to get rid of things like single family zoning, right? Because it's like, we're focusing on trying to build more housing in infill areas, but where can you do that without negatively impacting tenants through redevelopment? Like building more housing in single family areas and commercial areas, I would argue like our ideal approaches from that perspective, but those approaches also carry their own political challenges, right? And the state, has been chipping away at single family zoning, certainly through ADU laws and things like SB9 for several years now. And we think, we need to go farther to do that. But ultimately it's like, we have to like build the big tent that includes, people who are concerned about tenants' rights. Which we would include ourselves in that, right? Because it's like, yes, supply is very important, but not every project that increases supply has a positive impact on specific tenants. So it's like, we can't be afraid of that nuance. Like we have to try to integrate those two ideas.
Another question here. Are you aware of efforts to identify what law or policy changes will make the largest increase in new housing creating and quantify that increase?
I mean, I'm gonna have to apologize. I have some folks doing some gardening outside and I missed part of what you said there. And I think,
Let me read it again. Are you aware of efforts to identify what law or is it my connection that is bad? Can you hear me? Are you able to?
I'm having a little bit of trouble with your connection.
Oh, okay.
Or the connection.
All right. How about?
Wait, do you want me to do it? I can do it. Are you aware of efforts to identify what law or policy changes would make the largest increase in new housing creation and quantify that increase?
Yeah, so I know that there was an effort last year to there's a bill that California YIMBY was sponsoring that would have required basically like developers that take advantage of certain housing laws to report that to the state so that it would be easier to aggregate those data. And that bill did get vetoed. But I think that that's a reasonable approach because it would put, kind of like a minor additional administrative burden on housing development, but we would get a lot of good data to understand like what's working. And then, you know, just apart from that, there's so many people in the academic community are studying these initiatives, you know, through the Lewis Center and the Turner Center, and all the universities that are focused on urban planning and housing issues. So, you know, our academic partners are doing that work.
All right, let's go to the next question. Are you tracking how many authorities have jurisdiction have adopted SB10? Can you share which ones, if any?
No, I can't say that I'm tracking that. So, and just you know, for a little bit of background, SB10 is a bill that passed last year that allows local governments to complete certain kinds of rezonings in a ministerial way. So again, not subject to CEQA. This is one of the big issues with housing element implementation. So you know, we're tracking 15 housing elements in LA County for detailed reviews to make sure that they're compliant with the law, the letter and the spirit of the law, to actually, you know, meet our more ambitious housing production targets. It might be too much of a tangent, but there's a whole other conversation going on around the fact that, you know, most of the jurisdictions in LA County have not gained certification of their housing elements in a timely manner, which means they have to complete all their rezonings by October. And SB10 can be a tool that facilitates that process happening more quickly. The problem is it's not going to apply to like all of the rezoning actions that are needed, particularly in a bigger city like LA. And the other disadvantage of SB10 is that when you rezone ministerially, the projects that come in under that can still be subject to CEQA. Whereas like if you rezone through a CEQA process, then the projects that come in under can tier off of the environmental review for the rezoning and be approved more quickly. So it's an important tool that's out there, but I can't say that I have like a comprehensive view of how it's being used.
All right, it looks like those are all the questions we have for you, David. Unless if there's anything you would like to add on, David.
No, I just, you know, thank you all for coming, and you know, I just kind of wanted to emphasize that like this is a really critical week, kind of midway through the legislative session, because there's so many bills that are like on the floor of the Assembly and on the floor of the Senate right now. You know, we're particularly keeping an eye on AB 2097. So if you haven't had a chance to yet, or if you just feel like reinforcing it, like right now is a great time to contact your Assembly member and your senator and just let them know about some of these bills, and that, you know, you vote in their district, you care about this stuff, you know, you care about, like, you're looking to that person for leadership in solving the housing affordability crisis. And ultimately, like, you know, like our real power comes from you, like from the network of people that are doing that work and amplifying those messages. And ultimately, like, that's how we make change, is, you know, it's like people working together, speaking with a common voice, providing feedback also, that's also important. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, we have to let our legislators know that we expect them to do something about this. And, you know, I just encourage all of you to do that ASAP.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us to this afternoon. We really appreciate your time. We popped in here an email to send us any questions or anything, but I'm also going to give you guys my email address for any organizing opportunities in regards to these bills. My email address is Jaime at Abundant Housing LA. And want to give your email to David? Email addresses. You can just.
Sure, I'll drop it in the chat.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I'll pop in my email address here as well for, reach out to us if you guys have any questions in regards to organizing opportunities or any policy questions that you guys have for us. We'll be happy to help you with any way possible. But other than that, thank you so much for joining in. And we're looking forward to hearing from you guys or seeing you guys in any other events that we're going to be having. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining in, everyone. Have a good day.